Glenda Lee. Don't let him go. He's chasing fool's gold. But you see, if he went to South Dakota, he'd make lots of money. And then he could do all the things for me that I wanted. Because by this time, I didn't really love him. He was a meal ticket. I'd lost all respect for him, all respect for myself. And I could prostitute myself. Didn't bother me a bit, as long as my kids were fed and I got a few things out of it. So I encouraged him to go. I encouraged him to leave. Get out there, make that money, buddy. Get me what I want out of life. We had bought this house, and we were remodeling it. And of course, when he was working, he didn't have time to work on it. And when he wasn't working, we didn't have money. So we were sitting in this gutted out place, and I sat back and I waited for Tom to do things for me. It never dawned on me at that time in my life that I could have done things for myself. But that's another story. That comes with the evolution of attitude. When Tom went to South Dakota, he was out there maybe for 3 months, and school let out, and I went out with the 4 children. When I got there, he had been drinking. And I put in about 6 months. Once he got stuck in Rapid City, South Dakota, and they called me to come and get him. And we lived 20 miles outside of Sturgis. Bikers will know where that's at. And we were 20 miles off the main road. And when they called me to come and get him, I'll never forget the rage, the hatred. And you know what that does? That self-destructs. And I almost did a job on myself and my kids that night. I got in the car to go get him, so I could just do nothing but tell him what a lousy SOB he was. He'd be captive. Get him out of jail, let him know just how low he was in my estimation, in my book. What a rotten father, what a rotten person. I had it all planned. Tore out of that house, figuring it would take me maybe 45 minutes, an hour at the most, and I left my 4 children alone. Well, as most plans in anger don't work out, I hit a snowbank, went off the road. I remember getting out of the car, and I remember being snowblind instantly. Crawling in the middle of the road, I rolled down a gully, and I remember crying out, "Dear God," my first spiritual awakening. My kids are going to die. And they're going to die because I was so angry and so hateful and so vengeful. A fuel oil truck found me. They told me they picked me up in their headlights. I was crawling in the middle of the highway and my eyes were froze shut. And they couldn't turn around. That's how bad it was. And they took me into Sturgis, and I found somebody, one fellow that he worked with, that drove me back out, he and his wife. And I made up my mind then that I was going to leave Tom. Absolutely, this was it. Because I realized that I had almost killed my children as well as myself. And I couldn't stand it anymore. So I came back to Cleveland, Ohio, settled back in our little ripped-up house with 4 kids. And he passed by one day, and I opened the back door, and I looked at him, and it hit me. I didn't hate him anymore. I didn't love him anymore. I could look at him like I'd look through that exit sign at the end of the building. There was nothing. I had shut myself down so emotionally, I wouldn't let myself love him, and hate had gone beyond. And I'd given up hope, and I was going to take care of myself and my kids. Well, he did go to work in New York, and he did get a job, and then he came back to Cleveland because he called me with some kind of a suicide thing, and I thought, well, if he kills himself, I don't have any insurance. If he kills himself, at least maybe it'd be over, but I'd be stuck with 4 kids trying to raise them with no money. So I sent him money, and I condescendingly let him come back and sleep on the couch in the living room, like maybe a pet dog or something, or cat that you'd take in that needed a home. And of course I was this steely person, this sarcastic, nasty woman. And he went out and got drunk. The first paid check, And I remember he had me up against a wall and things were getting smashed, and I called the police and I pressed charges. I didn't drop them. I said, no, buddy, you're going to do your time. Well, they didn't send him away. They put him on probation. And meanwhile, my sister's husband had sobered up. And he came to the jail and he got Tom, and they went to their first AA meeting. And I, as a dutiful member of the community, went back to Al-Anon. And I waited for my due. Now, my husband got better. He went to a lot of meetings, which I resented bitterly because I thought if he was sober, he should stay home and at least start working on this house and doing the things I wanted him to do. And I was angry that he had friends because, see, I didn't have any friends. I didn't trust anybody, and I didn't want anybody giving me suggestions on how to run my life. And I had a terrible case of self-pity and resentment. Poor me. Look how I live. Look where my life has led me. I was coming up the basement stairway. By the way, Tom dug this basement by hand. The man who never did anything. You know, I never gave him credit for anything that he did try to do. I was coming up the basement stairway one day after about 18 months of his program and my program, my going to those meetings when I had other things to do. And I got to the top of the stairway, and I had a basket of laundry on one hand. And if you ever lived in a house that's remodeled, they have, you know, open 2x4s. I had punched every 2x4 coming up that stairway. And I didn't even realize it till I got to the top of the stairs, and I realized that my hand was bleeding. And I sat down in my kitchen, and I started to cry. I was so sick, and I was still doing the self-destruct. I was still hurting me to show you. Well, I went back to Al-Anon, and I started to listen. Now, see, I didn't know anything about steps. I hadn't listened. At that time, we also worked more on a little thing that was like just for today. And I got that out and I started to read that. Now, it never dawned on me that just for a day I could take responsibility for my happiness. I'd always blamed him for how I felt. He made me unhappy. He made me angry. He made me depressed. Never dawned on me that just for today I could choose how I wanted to feel. I always thought you had to react. I didn't know I could keep my mouth shut, say a prayer, be quiet, walk away. I always had to get the last word. Even when he had me by the throat up against a wall, I was given the last word. When I look back now and I think of how sick I was and how much I had to learn, little by little, I started doing things. Things that I had sat around and waited for Tom to do. And the change in attitude wasn't, poor me, look at, I have to paint the walls in my house. Poor me, look at, I have to wallpaper because he's too busy going to those meetings to do it. All of a sudden I thought, wow, look what you can do. Look what you can accomplish. You're not helpless. You can do some interesting things. And I started to develop myself through my Al-Anon program. I started giving myself pats on the back. See, I had this terrible thing that we either feel so totally down with no talent, no good things, or we are so socially superior that we're too good to do things. You know what, me get out and lay a brick, me get out and shovel a sidewalk. I finally got a balance in what I could do. And what I started to do with my life without resentment. One of the first things I did was I decided to do 3 things I didn't want to do. And I could do that for a day. And one was like be nice to my husband. The other one was like do my ironing. And one was maybe cook a nice meal. and then not get resentful if he didn't eat it. I had to practice this one day at a time concept. And that's how we started to get back and tried to rebuild a marriage. Now, I'm not going to tell you that our marriage turned around overnight. We had a lot of rebuilding. See, there was no trust. There was no respect. We had to build that a step at a time. About 10 years into my program of Al-Anon, our oldest son was 18, and one day he told me what I could do with my Al-Anon program, which was something, someplace where sun didn't shine. And, I always say crisis pushes us into action. And I had to reappraise where I was. And where I was I had taken my Al-Anon program for granted. I had it, didn't I? I had done all those steps. I'd learned all that stuff. And I started getting involved in outside activities, and I wasn't going to my meetings. And little by little, that thinking, that behavior sneaks back into your life, and you're not even aware of it. So the crisis with our oldest son, and he left home at that time, and he was gone for like 3 years. He did a stint with the Moonies. We didn't know where he was most of the time. It was a very hard time for us. But he pushed me into finding a spiritual program, which I had not had. Now, my husband had a spiritual program, and I just couldn't seem to get one. Well, that crisis sent me out, and I had to do some more digging, and I found one, which has held me in good stead the rest of this time. The oldest, 18, 17-year-old, big, quiet guy, just a great, big, 6'4", 200-pound captain of the football team, sweetheart. Would come home some nights, be a little talkative. Our alcoholic at 17. Now, how can you have this AA and this Al-Anon home and have alcoholics? Well, you got them. Because wherever it's at, it's in the genes, it's in the behavior, whatever. And I've come to the point that I realize that if you've got them, it's not a tragedy, it's not a disaster, because they have to get there to get here eventually. Tom went on with his program, I went on with my program, we raised the family. 1, 2, 3, the boys married. I have 3 marvelous daughter-in-laws, and thank God for Al-Anon, because it's opened me up so much. It's taught me that there's other ways to do things, and each one of my daughter-in-laws are individual people. And one taught me how to give time. She wasn't busy cleaning her house and doing her laundry and involved in activities, but she gave a lot of time to her children. And I thank her for that. That's my alcoholic's wife, Chris. I have a Chris that married a Chris, so it gets confusing at times. Kids are in their 20s. Our daughter at 23, who had gone to many, many meetings with her dad through the years, came to a meeting, and she heard a woman lead. Now, she had heard women lead many years through her life, but she was having a problem with depression. She was having a problem with, I call that party girl syndrome. You're out the night before, and everything's marvy and great and wonderful, and the next day you're ready to commit suicide, down, depressed, don't know what's wrong with your life. Well, she went to this meeting, and she heard a woman speak, and she came home and she said, Mom, she said, I didn't identify with the way she drinks, but she says, God, her ups and downs, her emotional patterns. She said, I think I'm just like my dad. I think I'm an alcoholic. She started to go to these meetings. During that time, her brother Chris, who had at that time 3 children, came to the house one day, and he was drunk. And he had a look in his eye, like my dad used to get. A mean, nasty look. And he stood in the doorway, and he filled that doorway, and I felt fear come up into my chest. And I looked at him and I said, Chris, you know how much I love you. You know how much your dad and I adore the ground you walk on. But you'll never come to my home again drunk. You frighten me, and I don't deserve to be frightened. I think Al-Anon gave me the courage to say that. I would not have had the courage before. I never told my dad that he frightened me. Chris did not run right out and join AA. But 6 months after his sister's commitment, he started looking at the program, and it wasn't long until he also admitted that he had a problem with the alcohol. I think maybe the programs, seeing the people in the home, they didn't have to go down and destroy their lives the way that their dad had done, and what I had done with my life. We were example, good and bad. I'll tell you that all three of my sons are married. They're still 21 years, 20 years, and 19 years this fall. And I laughingly say to them, well, you had a wonderful example. If your dad and I can do it, anybody can do it. They grew up in a home where they learned to work through conflict. Corrine got sober, and she got a marvelous job, and she was transferred to Florida. And her dad and I took her down to Florida. And we moved her into an apartment in May of 1985. And 2 weeks after we left our daughter and came home, I got a phone call after the policeman knocked on the door and was there with me to tell us that our daughter Corrine had been murdered. Now, dear God, how did these things happen? We had people come and say, why her? Why you? You never hurt anybody. She would have helped him. He was a cokehead. He was a drunk. He was on the prowl. He hated women. I dealt with that. My husband had a hard time. I never knew what one day at a time really meant. One day at a time means getting up and putting your feet on the floor when you don't want to live. One day at a time means holding on, quote, by your fingernails. And all I would think of was if I can get through today. And I realized I couldn't help my husband get through today. Three years after Corrine's death, after Tom's story, which you'll hear Sunday, he had a breakdown. And there's some strange things that happen now. Tom isn't here today with me. Tom's on a golf course because I insisted that Tom go play in that golf tournament today. I said, what kind of a tyrant do you think us Al-Anons are? You don't have to be here, so you don't have to prove you love me anymore. I know you love me. There's no proving anymore. We made a commitment to our marriage a long time ago, early on in his sobriety, because we knew there would be days when we wouldn't like each other. And we thought maybe the easiest way to handle this would make a commitment to our marriage. And that was one of the little tools that we used to help us come back together again. But anyhow, he's on the golf course today, because I insisted. And when he had his breakdown, and I realized that he was totally losing it in our kitchen, he had not drank, and he kept going to his meetings, but he had some terrible inner demons that nobody could help him with. And when he broke down, I thought, oh, it's Sunday morning. Where am I going to find my son? I'm going to find my son on a golf course with his AA buddies playing golf. God works in mysterious ways, because I got to the golf course, which was down the road from us, and they were coming in from their 9, and he took one look at me and said, Mom, what's wrong? And I said, it's your dad, Chris. He needs you. And those guys, I know they paid for 18, but they left the golf course instantly and came to the house. And I laughingly say, now that's love. Nobody said, well, I'm going to stay and finish the 9. They all came, and they folded my husband in the loving arms of AA. And they got him the help he needed. And his story is that of recovery and the blessings of this program. So when I tell you, if you have an alcoholic child, see, it was our alcoholic son, 5 years sober, that helped his father back into a new conception of life. Now, I would be lying if I told you that, quote, we are over the death of our daughter. You don't get over it. You scab over, you learn to go on. One of my big problems was, aren't you supposed to forgive? And I had an Al-Anon sister that handed me a tool that I'll be forever grateful for. They had lost a son under very mysterious circumstances. And she told me, she said, I was so angry, and somebody had told her, you say, God, if there's something you think you can't handle, I'm going to let you do it. Now, maybe someday I'll be strong enough to handle this forgiveness issue. But right now I'm not. And that's what I do. I do it one day at a time. I've tried to make my amends. I think every time we have some young recovering person in our home, I see the power and the Spirit of God in them. I refuse to let the evil and the destruction that came into our lives destroy all the good that we know that this program has brought to us. The man that killed our daughter is in prison in Florida. I work with a community corrections program. I feel every life that I touch, although I can't handle him, I can handle this. I make coffee every December in my Al-Anon group. I'm signed up, I'm on a roster. Holidays are hard. That's where I need to be. I get into the holiday spirit with my coffee on the group GR. Not even so much because I want to be, because nobody else took the job. So on the GR. And Tom and I try to keep very active in our programs. A man that I thought that I could never love, a man that I thought I could never respect, I adore, I love. He is my best friend today. At one time, he was my worst enemy. Maybe I was my worst enemy. I'm here to bring you a message of hope. Out of the 4 children, 2 are alcoholics. Our daughter did die in sobriety. She had 2.5 years sobriety when she was killed. And our son now has close to 14 years in February. And I'm looking at some papers by the 19-year-old grandson and by one of the 14-year-old grandsons, and I'm thinking, golly, maybe it'll be out there for them too. The irony and the part that you have to laugh at is that you come in here with all this garbage and you work your way through it with your spouse, and then you work your way through it with your kids, and now you're into the next generation, and I'm just praying that my grandson doesn't get somebody pregnant and I got a great grandchild coming down the road, because I'm going to feel like, I handle one day at a time. And today's been a wonderful day. I'm a morning person. Could God have blessed me more by 10 o'clock in the morning, because by 3 in the afternoon, you're not going to catch me. I'm going to be taking a nap. So everything worked out great for us, and I hope it works out great for you the rest of the weekend here at the conference. And that somebody somewhere says something that makes you know that you can make it one more day. Thank you.
What a wonderful, encouraging story we have this morning. We'd like to close in the usual way with the Serenity Prayer and Our Father. Our Father, who art in heaven,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen. You come back. It works if you work it.
Good morning. I'm so honored to be here. I always figure sometimes you have to take me to get my husband, so I was always the tag along with Tom until I developed my own identity, and that's what our Al-Anon program is about. I want to thank the committee for having us here. We've had a wonderful time. We've done some exploring. We've eaten in the best restaurants. We've met some of the neatest people and had a chance to explore your boardwalk, and I even dragged Tom around Annapolis on the way down, so we got a little bit of education in too. It always amazes me when people introduce me as a lady. I was not always a lady. And as I tell you my story, because that's what we're here for, we share our strength, our experience, and our hope. And I go back a little bit into my life to let you know what I was like, how it is now, and what I am trying to do with my life today. I will tell you that I'm going to use a word here that sometimes is not well received, but you'll see that it ties in down the road. I am not only the wife of an alcoholic, I am the daughter, the granddaughter, the aunt, the sister-in-law, and I think maybe, from what I see, the grandmother of alcoholics. So you can see that alcoholism has been in my life directly and indirectly ever since the day I was born. And I'll qualify that a little bit by telling you that I'm as old as AA, and read your history and figure that out for yourself. I am also, quote, the adult child of an alcoholic. And I kind of fought that for a long time. Not that I didn't know that I came from a home where my dad drank very heavily, but I never admitted or looked into some of the effects that had on me as I got older. And the only reason I'm mentioning that is because I believe some of the behaviors I brought to our marriage and our relationship were the direct result of what I saw in my home when I was growing up. Now, I will tell you this. I'm the eldest of three. I have a sister 3.5 years younger, whose husband is in the program, has almost as long sobriety as my husband. I have a brother who is 8 years younger. He is also in the program and has been for a good 25 years or so. So we all have done something with our lives. And sometimes you wonder why you're brought to the point you are brought to. And I have to believe that we're led down some type of a divine road, and sometimes we can't question where it leads us. My dad was a very hard-working construction worker, and Daddy did everything he could to give us a good life. And I know that now. I know both of my parents did. But see, when my dad drank, my dad became something like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde personality. And I grew up in a home where I knew every payday my dad was going to go out and get drunk. And my dad wasn't a bar drinker. He brought it home. He'd come home stumbling drunk. There'd be fights, there'd be arguments, there'd be physical violence. Myself being the oldest, I very early learned to get in between and try to stop it. I remember Christmas Eve when I took my dad's liquor, and I could not have been more than 7 years old, and I poured it down the drain. And then I remember the scene that followed afterwards when he thought my mother had done it, and me trying to fix things, always trying to fix things. I had a sister who hid under the covers, but I was the fighter. I was the one that was going to get out there and change things. There was a time in my dad's life and in my life when I was maybe 8. It's funny how we remember. When my dad didn't drink. Now this had to be just after the Second World War. And AA was in the Cleveland area, and my dad went to some meetings, and there was like 18 months, a year and a half or so that he didn't drink. And my memories of that time, it's funny, is taking walks and going to get malted milks with my dad. Something happened and my dad started to drink. That was life. That's how it was. My parents moved out to the country, and we moved to this little town west of Cleveland where I grew up. My teenage years, my growing up years. To tell you that I did not handle things well would be putting it mildly. I was a budding juvenile delinquent. My thing was, you hurt me, I'll hurt you. I'll show you. And I carried that pattern through most of my life too. You hurt me, I'll show you. I'll hurt me. I'll get even. When I was 15 years old, my parents put me in a home for girls, and it was run by the nuns of the Good Shepherd. And I, quote, got direction. And the sisters really knew how to show you direction. But I also gained, at that time, a little bit of confidence in myself. See, I wasn't the dumb person I thought I was. There wasn't the excitement. There wasn't the boys, the bars, the parties, the things like that around to distract me. And I kind of got a handle on a little tiny bit of my potential. And I settled down, and I know now the sacrifice that my parents made doing what they had to do at that time to save me from me. I had all this inside of me, and I didn't know what to do with it. And I pushed the self-destruct buttons every time I got a chance. After I come out of that school, which I spent a year at, I went on and I went into nurses training. My mistake was I didn't go far enough away from home, because I still wanted to come home every weekend and check on Mom and Dad and be sure that everything was going smooth, knowing that I'd probably be the one that would break up the arguments. I'd be the one that would be trying to smooth things over. I also remember having that yo-yo feeling. You know, you love your parents, you hate your parents. If my mother wouldn't do this, if my mother wouldn't talk back, then maybe my dad wouldn't act the way he acted. I always tried to figure out what we did that my dad had to drink and turn into this horrible person. So I can see that now. You know, if I'm real good, he won't. Well, it didn't stop him. If I'm real bad, it didn't stop him either. So after I went into nurses training, I come home on weekends doing my usual checkups. I was probably born to be an Al-Anon because this control thing was with me from the beginning. And one weekend, I missed a bus. Now, I always say we write our own history. We got to be careful sometimes what we do, because later on it's going to come back to haunt us. And Tom and I have 6 grandchildren. And a few years ago when the kids were little, they gave me this beautiful bound book called Grandma's Memories. And Grandma is supposed to put all these wonderful things about how she grew up and how she met Grandpa and what life was like raising her family. Well, I always try to choke on this part. But Grandma met Grandpa. Grandma was hitchhiking and Grandpa picked her up. And then I go on to explain how you lived in the country and you missed a bus and you had to get out and get your own way in if you missed the bus. And I was with 2 other girls on my way into Cleveland for a night of fun and frolic. And this car went by and I got out in the street and hiked up my skirt and waved him down. And I always said, my God, fate. He slammed on the brakes and he picked us up. And he was different. He had one of these DA haircuts, and he talked funny. He was from Brooklyn. Just charmed the daylights out of me. He had been drinking a little bit, and I noticed that right away. That smell of beer and juicy fruit gum always turned me on. So that night, he dropped us off. He introduced himself and he dropped us off, and we went our merry way. And when I come home that night, I told my mother, I said, I gave this fella that I met my address and my phone number, and he's going to call. I hope he calls. I prayed he'd call, because I was instantly infatuated. Well, he did call. And this whole relationship, of course, started off on deceit. Now, I didn't spend too much time in a kitchen. I was too interested in other things, and I had a sister who I thought was real dumb. She was always out learning how to make cookies and do stuff like this. But that wasn't where my interests lie. And my mother was a marvelous cook. And my dad was out of town. He was working down on the Ohio River on a construction job. And I invited Tom to come and have dinner. And as he walked up the driveway after parking his car, I told my mother, I said, quick, tie the apron on me. I want him to think I cooked this. Well, funny part is she's still cooking for him today. I think he fell in love with my mother's cooking. But I did. I was infatuated. And I just spent every moment with him. I'd go to nurses' school. I had a job at St. Joseph's Hospital, and I was in training. And he'd pick me up, and we were together. His shift was different, so he would take me to work, and he'd sleep, and then he'd pick me up after work, and he'd go to work at midnight. So we spent every moment together. Now, during this time, my dad come home, and my dad and Tom had gone out to get to know each other. Tom talks about this in his lead. To say that that meeting led to slight confrontation would be putting it mildly. Because my father, with drinking with Tom, realized that he drank too much. And no matter what my dad was, or what he didn't want that for his daughter. So he told Tom that he didn't want that for his daughter. And that didn't go over too well. And what we did to solve the big problem was 4 weeks after I met him, we ran away and got married. There, I fixed you. And we started out. Now, what we neglected to think about was money, how we were going to live. He did have a job, which he lost within a week after we were married because he didn't show up for work. He was drunk. And who did we have to rely on but my mom and dad? My parents had just built a 2-bedroom garage behind the house, and we took the front door off, and we put windows in, and we put a little side entrance, and we made this into this honeymoon cottage, which we were going to live in temporarily until I had my fantasy world. Because you see, I was going to marry, and I was going to have all the material things that I didn't have, that my parents couldn't give me, and I was going to have the perfect marriage and a little cottage with the white fence and the roses growing on it. And my life was going to be totally different. I'll tell you that I jumped out of the frying pan into the fire, and I think we all did this. My sister married the day after her 17th birthday, and my brother married when he was 16. I think we all thought we were going to escape the alcoholic home, and that our lives were going to be different. Well, you know what? When Tom and I were dating, and early on in our marriage, I drank with him. We'd go out, I'd have a few drinks, things would be fun, we'd sing, we'd dance, we'd talk to people, we'd go to parties. But sometime during the night, I did something wrong. I either counted his drinks, I suggest we leave. I'd leave a drink on the bar. What's wrong with you? Drink that. There'd always be a fight. And I would come home and I'd get dumped off in the driveway, and with a spin of gravel, he'd leave. And I would go in the house and I would cry, trying to figure out what I had done that made him drink. We very shortly had our son, Chris. And then we separated for a while. My mother laughingly said there should have been one of those revolving doors on this cottage, because every time I was disappointed in Tom or we had an argument, I threw him out. After all, it was my parents' house, right? So I'd throw him out, and then when he'd come back and promise that he wasn't going to drink anymore and things were going to be different, I would take him back. But what he had to do was prove that he loved me. Because, see, I thought he drank, and that proved that he didn't love me. I thought every time he told me that he wasn't going to drink anymore, he was lying to me. I didn't know anything about a disease called alcoholism. I drank, but enough's enough. Got things to do the next day, had children to take care of. And I couldn't figure out why he couldn't operate the way I operated. If he'd do it my way, we wouldn't have any trouble. Everything would be fine. I wanted to get on with my life, and I wanted my dreams to come true. Well, my agenda wasn't my husband's agenda. My husband lived in this alcoholic way of operating where he couldn't get along without a drink. Now, he promised me he wasn't going to drink, but then he'd break his promise. My dad, when he drank, after a weekend of drinking, would be so full of remorse that he'd go out and he'd spend money that he didn't have to make it up to us, to show us how much he loved us. And I expected my husband to, quote, show me how much he loved me. It was a long time after we both came into this program that I realized that I had contributed to our bankruptcy, and I had contributed to our indebtedness because of the things I expected from my alcoholic. He had to buy me things to show me he loved me. Material things. Don't tell me, show me, prove it. And that's the behavior that it took me a long time to accept that I had contributed, because I thought it was all his fault. Everything was his fault. I spent a lot of time crying as a young woman. After the second pregnancy, we separated for a while, and he came back. Maybe it was 3 months. We had one of those wonderful makeup sessions, you know, that you're going to have when you get back together. And I got pregnant. And with this pregnancy, now this is 1, 2, 3. With this pregnancy, I didn't want this child. And I tried to abort him. That did not work, thank God, to this day. Because my third son was born on my 20th birthday. And he's the joy of my life. He's left-handed like his mom. He's probably most like me. I never would have known that. I was so caught up. You know, when people say, how could you? How could somebody? I know how they could. Because I could very well, out of my own desperation, have aborted that child. Because I didn't think I could handle anymore. I was so unhappy, so downtrodden, so bedraggled at 20 years of age that I contemplated suicide. I was very ill most of the time. I had terrible migraine headaches. I had a doctor who helped me out with a little Demerol, and I took Demerol even when I didn't have a headache because life was so painful. After Craig was born, and Tom had come back, and we had tried to put our life together again. After he was born, we separated for about 1.5 years. And this time, it was over. You know, you start feeling like a fool. You wonder how you can love somebody who treats you like this. And I did love him. I was putty in his hands. All he'd have to do was come in and put his arms around me, and I'd melt. Little by little, that feeling started to go away. I got so I wouldn't let him touch me. And I tried all the manipulations. I tried everything, all the tricks in the book. I was Mrs. Clean. I was Mrs. I'm going on strike. I'm not doing anything. I'd have out the latest sex manuals. I'd think, well, boy, this will really keep him around. I'll learn all this stuff. That didn't work. He'd come home, I'd cut him off. I did everything known, every trick in the book to control my husband's behavior. And in the doing, I was doing nothing but making myself sick. I didn't have time for my children. They'd toddle over to me or they'd want something and I'd say, get away, can't you see I'm worrying? Can't you see I'm crying? These are babies, these are little kids. And I'm so full of me and what's happening in my life. You talk about miracles. The miracles is that these young people got raised. That to me is a miracle. 2 sick kids trying to raise children. I wouldn't go through those years again for all the tea in China. After we separated for a while, and I went to work as a waitress, and my mother and my dad, of course, took on the responsibility for the three boys. I steeled myself. I even tried to date, and that didn't really work because I wasn't very trustful. And who wants a 20-year-old with 3 kids? And I think Tom was going his own way at that time too. Well, he stopped drinking, and he started to court me again. And you know what? I fell into the trap again. I believed him. And we decided that maybe if we got away and took the geographical cure and we went and lived away from my parents. Now, this is no logic to this at all. Because Mom and Dad had been feeding us and giving us shelter, but we were going to get away on our own. So we moved into Cleveland. And we planned this pregnancy because he was sober. And we were going to start over. Well, you know what happened. I got pregnant and he started to drink again. And in the very early stages of this pregnancy, I found out that, oh my God, my husband had been unfaithful to me. Well, this was another blow. This was something that, quote, I always said I would never put up with, I'd never forgive, I'd never get over. Well, I didn't intend to. I intended to get even. And I laughingly said at that time, I had put on my best sled outfit, and my best sled outfit was like a short skirt and a pair of white boots, and I set out to go and get even. I was going to go out and pick up a man and do to him what he did to me. That pattern, I didn't know anything. You got even, you got back. I will never forget this as long as I live, because it was tragic and it was funny. And it was another thing when you think of what you could have done to yourself and your family. I went down into the sleaziest part of Cleveland, and I sat on a bar stool, and back then I wasn't too shabby. And it didn't take long, and some fella come over, and he sat down, and he leaned over and looked in my eyes. He says, "Can I buy you a drink, miss, honey?" And I looked at him, and I smiled, and I went, oh my God, my husband's been unfaithful. I don't know what I'm going to do. This man actually went like, well, after listening to me, he said to me, he said, you know what, you don't belong here. He said, let me take you home. He said, I'm going to take you to the corner of your street. He said, I'm not going to drop you off in front of your house, dear. But he says, I'm going to take you to the corner of your street. He says, you go home to your son, to your kids, to your family, and to your husband. And he says, you try to work this out. He says, but I got a little bit of advice for you. He says, the next time your old man does something like this, he says, for Christ's sake, don't come down here and screw up some other guy's one night out. Lesson learned. You know, that daughter, that child, that beautiful little girl that we wanted after 3 sons was born. And I remember Tom putting his hand on her beautiful head of jet black hair and saying, this child will never see me drunk. And of course, once again, I believed. I got sucked in. Well, he did drink again. With each episode, with each broken promise, I got harder and harder. I became a very brittle, sarcastic, unbelieving, ill, physically and mentally and emotionally ill woman. We had lived near a railroad track, and sometimes Tom would make it as far as the driveway and he'd pass out in the car. And I had worked out a plan, and my plan was that when he passed out, I'd push him over and I'd drive to the railroad track and I'd leave the car there. Then I'd rush back home, and I actually would stand in front of my mirror and practice the expression on my face when they come to tell me he was killed. Because of course, I had to, would it be like, I'd go through this whole thing, and I mean hours. There was laundry to be done. There was cooking. There were kids to be taken care of. And I had all these plans. I was always going to find another Prince Charming, someone nicer to take me away from this. And then I'd look at the reality of the situation and realize that by this time, in my 20s, I probably looked older than I do today, because I was so sick and so beat down and so ashamed because I loved an alcoholic. Mad at myself, angry. I didn't know what to do. There was some physical violence in our life, and I'd call the police, and they'd get there, and then I'd drop the charges because he promised that things would be better. And I had done that many times. This one time, after one of these episodes, my dear brother-in-law, who my sister and I realized that we had gotten into a jackpot when we had two guys that drank, and they liked to drink together. So my sister and I would arrange not to see each other for months at a time, because I blamed her husband, she blamed my husband, I blamed all their friends. You were always blaming somebody else for what the alcoholic was doing. And I didn't like anybody. And like I said, I didn't even see my own sister, because her husband was a bad influence. And if we stayed away from them, he wouldn't drink. I remember one time, the fellas, they had gotten together, it was around Christmas, and they'd gone shopping, and they dropped in to visit us. And the guy said, well, I'll go get some chickens, because you girls shouldn't cook. And they left. And 3 days later, they came back. I mean, that's how it was. It was like, here you are, and they're gone, and nobody knows where they're at. And that you never could rely, you never could believe, you never could have faith. In the 60s, my sister and I decided that we would divorce our husbands. I had put in that by this time almost 7-8 years of marriage, and nothing was getting any better. And we had a friend who was a lawyer and a judge, and he said that he knew we didn't have any money, that he would give us 2 divorces. There's nothing to file papers and duplicate, just change the name, and he'd do it for the price of 1. And we were ready to go ahead with this whole plan. And my brother-in-law came and asked for some help. He come up and he said, geez, she's going to divorce me. And I liked him. He wasn't as bad as my husband. I did a lot of that comparing stuff, too. Nobody else was as bad as my husband. And in the interim, the fellas went to their first AA meeting. Well, when they went to their first AA meeting, somebody contacted me and suggested that I go to an Al-Anon meeting. And I went to keep him sober. I did not go for myself, because there was the problems in our life were all his fault. And if he wouldn't drink, then everything else in our life would be great. I could have my agenda, I could work on my plan, and he would quit messing up my life. So I went along to my first Al-Anon meeting, and I met this wonderful woman, and she was a lady, and I was not a lady. Ladies don't stand over their husbands with a claw hammer in their hands, screaming obscenities and wondering if I could strike the first blow and kill him while he's in the bathtub nude, knowing he can't chase me very far. I mean, ladies don't act this way. Ladies don't stand on the front porch when people bring your drunken husband home and they're good enough to maybe drive the car and yell, "You paid professional," but not quite in that language. I was such a hateful, vindictive person at that time in my life, I could hardly stand myself. And I did contemplate suicide. But the only thing that stopped me was what would happen to my children, because this drunken bum sure wouldn't raise them. The guys went to their first AA meeting. We went to our first Al-Anon meeting, and I met a lady. And she was marvelous. She had everything in life that I wanted and I didn't have. She was everything that I thought I wanted to be, and I wasn't. And I hated her guts. She disgusted me. She'd call me on the phone in the morning to find out how I was. And I don't have time to talk to you. I'm busy. I've got problems. I'm too busy cleaning up the messes that my husband's made. My attitude was so bitter. I'd go and I'd sit at the meetings. I'd say the right things. I'd act the right way. I even have a tape that says back in 1962, I was secretary of a meeting. They announced my name on the tape. So I know that I, quote, got in there and did my best. I tried to take my part, but I didn't do that for my husband. I mean, for me, I did that for him.